Hi, I'm Tom Harwood and this is GBN Originals. Now, as we all know by now, the government has been desperately trying to reach a deal with Mauritius to cede sovereignty of the Chagos archipelago, also known as the British Indian Ocean Territory. But, and here's the crucial but, all whilst retaining control of the crucial UK-US military base, Diego Garcia. It's hard to stress just how important Diego Garcia is, how crucial it is to global security. The strategic location of the base allows for the vital global reach for the Western Alliance. The British government understands how important this base is, which explains the fervent negotiations that have been taking place to retain the base. It explains how these negotiations could set the British taxpayer back by up to £18 billion, an astonishing amount of money. We can all see why the base is important, but the bizarre fact in all of this is that the negotiations appear to be kicking off from a starting point of losing the islands. Losing the islands and then clawing back the base. Even then, only for a time-limited period. It sounds like an extraordinarily bad deal. Why are we starting from here? Why is the government falling over itself to shell out up to £18 billion of your money simply to keep something that we already have for free? Why has the government been so desperate to send so much money overseas for a base on islands that we already own? Finally, the government has produced a reason. Yes, ministers had been bizarrely tight-lipped until the Prime Minister's official spokesperson finally spilled the internal beans. Yes, Number 10 says it all comes down to the little-known, but fairly important, electromagnetic communications system at the base. Stay with me here. The satellite and radio communications systems the base relies on may not be able to operate without legal certainty. That's the argument of the government. This is because the divvying up of the electromagnetic spectrum that facilitates this high-tech communication is all governed by a UN agency called the International Telecommunication Union. It's based in Switzerland. Yes, the government fears that the International Telecommunication Union will take an advisory ruling of the International Court of Justice, another UN agency, as binding. Of course, both the ITU and the ICJ are UN bodies. Now, this International Court of Justice ruling was decided back in February 2019. It found that the United Kingdom must end its administration of the Chagos Islands as rapidly as possible. The ruling came after the United Nations General Assembly voted by 94 countries to 15 to refer what the motion was described as a territorial dispute between the UK and Mauritius to the ICJ to adjudicate. Well, fewer than half the countries that are UN members voted to refer the case, but as most countries simply didn't bother to vote one way or the other, the case was referred in 2017.
Have you been getting a load of spam in your email recently? What about random calls? It's really annoying, isn't it? Data brokers are out there collecting your personal information. Anything from your email, your full name, your address, and even your political affiliation. Cyber criminals can even use AI to mimic the voices of friends and family to trick people into sending them money. And it gets even worse. People out there are getting huge loans taken out in their names without even knowing about it. But don't worry, because the sponsor of this video, Incogni, can help. They reach out to the data brokers on your behalf and request that your information is removed from their databases. Incogni continues to make sure that your data is removed automatically from the internet via repeated removal requests. So, how can you get started? Well, step 1, hit the link in the description, create an Incogni account and tell us whose data you'd like removed. Step 2, grant Incogni the right to work on your behalf. Step 3, sit back, relax, and watch Incogni work. They will update consistently so you know when your data has been removed. Incogni is risk-free for 30 days, so you can try it for yourself and you'll get a free refund if the service isn't for you. So take back your personal data today with Incogni. Use the code GBNews using the link in the description below and you'll get 60% off an annual payment plan.
And let's fast forward to 2019 now, when the ICJ concludes the case. It tells Britain it must end its administration of the Chagos Islands. It rules that the sun must set on the British Empire, quote, as rapidly as possible. And yet, that was 6 years ago. The government of Boris Johnson simply refused to recognise this advisory ruling. Yes, the Foreign Office Minister at the time, Sir Alan Duncan, told the House of Commons the following. We have concluded that the approach set out in the advisory opinion failed to give due regard to material facts and legal issues that the UK government explained in detail in our submissions to the ICJ. For instance, it didn't take into account the 1965 agreement with Mauritius or the numerous affirmations of that agreement made by Mauritius since independence. Furthermore, it fails to address the fact that the UK and US have entered into a binding treaty obligation to maintain UK sovereignty over the whole territory until at least 2036. Yes, Sir Alan, speaking for the government, of course, continued. When the UN General Assembly voted on the matter in May this year, following the ICJ advisory opinion, we fully expected a large number of member states to support the resolution in Mauritius's favour, framed as it was around the emotive theme of decolonisation. However, it is important to note that nearly 80 member states did not vote in favour of the resolution. Many of them shared our concern that Mauritius had circumvented the principle that the ICJ should consider bilateral disputes only with the consent of the states. Furthermore, some states explained publicly that they had voted in favour of the resolution out of respect for the ICJ, and not necessarily because they agreed with the substance of the resolution. Yes, the British government under Prime Minister Boris Johnson took issue with this advisory ruling and refused to implement it. And, well, nothing happened. The UN didn't strip Diego Garcia and the base of its right to satellite communication. Life simply went on. Until 2022, that is, when the British government under Liz Truss, reportedly in efforts to bring a coalition of African countries into the fold of a global sanctions regime on Russia following the invasion of Ukraine, well, at that point, the UK acknowledged the advisory ICJ ruling and began negotiations with Mauritius. You can sort of see why they're trying to bring more African countries for a foreign policy purpose. Arguably a foreign policy purpose that now no longer exists. Well, the Conservative Party now says that a year later these negotiations were shut down by the then Foreign Secretary David Cameron, as the demands of Mauritius crossed various red lines. So let's fast forward to the summer of 2024 and the new Labour government restart those negotiations. Well, today we now know, thanks to the internal concerns over satellite communication. But is the government being taken for a ride here? Are they overreacting to overly legalistic speculation? Speculation that ignores the reality of hard military power and bigger army diplomacy. Well, this is, after all, a military base that's used by the world's sole superpower we're discussing. Is the advice in this case coming from lefty lawyers or genuine military strategists? How could Boris Johnson's government seemingly ignore this advisory ruling with no consequences for the operational security of the base? And what role does the decades-long friendship with our now Prime Minister Keir Starmer and the lawyer Philip Sands KC, that of course is the man who's acting as the lawyer for the Mauritian government, what role does their strong friendship play in all of this? We have to ask ourselves, would the International Telecommunication Union really strip this significant UK-US base of its communications? Boris Johnson's government clearly believed it would not. And there's one more thing to consider here. Could this all be a ploy by China to assert greater influence over these islands? It's well known that China has been developing investment partnerships in African countries, winning favour, exerting economic control, and winning votes in forums like the UN. China would love nothing more than the British to lose control of these islands in the middle of the Indian Ocean. They would love nothing more than to establish a presence on these islands for an expansionist China. It's worth looking back to a report by Parliament's powerful and respected Intelligence and Security Committee back in 2023. It found that the International Telecommunication Union was an organisation in which China has acquired disproportionate influence, including numerous leadership positions. Well, given this, has the ITU pulled the wool over the British government's eyes? And is China taking us all for fools? Has the British government fallen for a bluff or for a trap? Well, one of the most frustrating elements of this entire process is we keep learning about this deal by what's happening in the Mauritian Parliament more than the British Parliament. The British Foreign Office is refusing to release details of these negotiations to British lawmakers, all the while Mauritian lawmakers learn every step of the way. Well, here at GB News we're keeping abreast of it all, and we'll continue to scrutinise the extraordinary surrender of sovereignty that appears to be happening here on GB News Originals. So remember to subscribe to stay up to date with this baffling and embarrassing saga.